Welcome to RIA Beyond, a Clean Facts and RIA media collaboration. In today's episode, we're going to tackle a topic that affects every corner of the restoration industry, insurance fraud. But instead of just pointing fingers, we're taking a broader look at the entire ecosystem. What does fraud really look like from both sides? Where are the gray areas? And more importantly, what can ethical professionals actually do to protect their businesses and the integrity of the industry? We're joined by experts who work to help us break it all down and offer practical guidance you can use right away. It's my pleasure to welcome Brent Walker, Director of Government Affairs for the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud, and Joe Scroggins, the COO at Peak Alliance. Gentlemen, thank you for giving up a few minutes today to join us on this program. Let's get to know you a little bit before we jump into our topic today. Brent, where do we find you today? Where do you live and work? Tell us about yourself and your company.
Yeah, where I live and work. So, the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud is a nonprofit organization, and that headquarters is in DC, but I live in Houston, Texas. So, if I can, I'll tell you a little bit about the coalition. The Coalition Against Insurance Fraud is a nonprofit. As I mentioned, our membership is diverse. That means we have government agencies as members, insurance companies, consumer groups, educational institutions, and anti-fraud partners in the ecosystem, service providers, etc. Many associations also belong to the coalition. The common theme is a willingness to fight insurance fraud. And just a quick little snip about my background. Have over 20 years in the insurance industry, specifically in fighting insurance fraud as an investigator, manager, etc. I lead the coalition's government affairs program. We advocate for good, strong law that will help both regulatory and legislative to fight insurance fraud. I serve as a consumer rep with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, where we get to advocate for consumer interests as well. And I'm so pleased to have served as an advisor on RIA's Carrier Representative Task Force most recently. So thank you, Jeff, for having this conversation.
You're welcome, and thank you for being here. I know this is a big topic we're going to talk about today. And Joe, tell us about yourself. Where are you located and about your company as well?
Yeah, so I'm located in New Hampshire. Peak Alliance is headquartered out of New York City. I spend most of my time traveling to all of our member companies. So home is New Hampshire. Where I'm at just depends on where I am week to week, which brand I'm supporting. But about myself, I have spent my entire career in restoration. I've worked through technician, project management, large loss catastrophe response, acquisitions, growing businesses, working on the franchise side and working on the independent side. I'm an operator through and through. I enjoy conversations about how to do restoration, but I love talking about business and I love talking about the relation between operations of restoration and the insurance ecosystem. Peak Alliance is a member of partner companies. We work alongside and acquire majority shares within independent restoration businesses. Where we're different is we partner alongside those owners and coaching them through growth, helping them with things like insurance operations, margin, control, finance support, as well as sales and growing the business. And so this is an area I spend a lot of my time with, as you can imagine, supporting smaller independent businesses around the country on how to protect what they've built and ensuring their reputation is strong within the industry. I'm an RIA member as well. I serve on the AGA Education Task Force, work really closely in developing training for RIA white papers and best practices.
Well, I am in good company when it comes to today's topic about insurance fraud and what to do with this whole issue. And let's get started. And Joe, we'll start with you. Let's start wide on this topic. When you look across the insurance and restoration ecosystem, as you might say, what does fraud actually look like today? And where are you seeing it show up most often?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeff. The reality is Whoever controls the scope controls the money. And right now, both sides are feeling that pressure. You've got carriers on one end who are trying to control the scope to control or reduce costs. And then the other end, we have contractors that in some cases, unfortunately, are stretching the scope to protect their own margin. That's happening. It's not so much the more like obvious, I'm lighting a fire outside of my garage to get a check. It's more of these like nuanced protection mechanism. It's not random. It's just economics. Margins are tightening across the industry. The state of the industry report came out last week for last year, and margins continue to tighten, and cash flow continues to slow down. And that's where the line is. If the scope is being shaped to hit certain financial outcomes instead of reflecting actual conditions on the ground of the project, the system starts to break down, and there's this temptation to insert a little hints of fraud increases as margins tighten and you experience cash flow pressures. Here's the reality. If margins only exist when the scope gets stretched, it's not a scoping problem, it's a pricing problem. And so either costs are out of control or pricing hasn't been adjusted appropriately for the actual work. And so true professionals, they separate themselves by staying disciplined. They build scopes off the job, not off the number. They let the documentation carry it. We'll talk about it later, tips and tricks that contractors can use to protect their business, hit healthy margins without manipulating the scope to do it. For carriers on the flip side, the scope is what it is. It shouldn't be picked apart or selectively interpreted to hit a certain number or perceived outcome. And so when standards are applied consistently, selectively, the process works. When it's not, it erodes the confidence in the standards, and that's when there's temptations to push boundaries. I'd close with this. The industry really gets into trouble when we oversimplify into heroes and villains, us versus them. The real issue is, what are the incentives and pressures, and what are they doing to the decision-making process across the entire ecosystem of the restoration space?
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate those details. Good commentary. And Brent, let's go to you. Any follow-up to that you'd like to share?
No, I think Joe was accurate, right? And I want to point out that the restoration industry does important work, right? You think about the insurance consumer, they have faced some loss, possibly a tragedy, post-disaster, and everyone in that ecosystem that Joe talks about is important. The insurance company, the contractors, the restoration professionals, and it is to get that consumer back to pre-loss condition. And so I agree. On the topic of fraud, yeah, just if it feels like you're cutting corners, it's probably wrong, right? And as Joe said, the scope, the estimate should be what it is. And there's a trust there that it's accurate, it's transparent. And when that trust is broken down and negotiations or settlement stalls, it's ultimately the consumer who pays the price. And so when fraud creeps into that process from any direction, the true loser is the consumer. And so, yeah, what does fraud look like? Again, billing for things that aren't rendered, that haven't been done, overinflating, and just like Joe mentioned, I get it. The pressures are real. Prices, cost, the pressures are real. But that temptation to cut corners and perhaps be not accurate, not honest, that's where fraud creeps in.
Thank you, Brent. Let's stick with you on this question. There's a lot of talk about bad actors. Maybe there's some gray area there. What are some of those gray areas or behaviors that professionals might not even realize cross the line? Brent?
Well, you mentioned bad actors, right? Well, let's just say right off, there are bad actors. We get it, right? Unfortunately, that's the reality of the world, regardless of industry and profession. But good people can make bad decisions, and they often do, right? When they're faced with some of the pressures that Joe mentioned, or even the homeowner or the building owner can make bad decisions faced with the worst moment in their life. And so having an ethical foundation and an awareness of where those gray areas are at so you don't cross the line are important. To the restoration listeners out there, don't just automatically try to copy what everyone else is doing to stay competitive. I get it. It's tough. That's a tough one because bad actors, if we're using that term, bad actors do make it tough for the good guys to compete. And so the pressures are real. And so I applaud those that do the right thing, not only for their business, but for the customer. And, be accurate. Your scope, your estimate, your documentation needs to be accurate. And when the focus is on financial gain and not the customer, I think that's when lines get crossed. And over time, a repeated pattern of that looks like to fraud investigators or regulators a pattern of fraud, even though it may not be. Again, awareness of what's right and wrong is important. And then finally, don't cross the line into like unlicensed activity, especially I mentioned in the public adjuster regulated profession. From a contractor restoration perspective, when you start getting into insurance policy descriptions, coverage interpretations, or you're negotiating with the insurance company, you may want to check each state jurisdiction because each state may have a carve out for what's licensed regulated conduct for the profession of public adjusters. And I see that sometimes where contractors may cross that line. Even though they're trying to do the right thing for the customer, there are some boundaries. And again, I just will point back to having some awareness of where those lines are at will help honest restoration contractors avoid them.
Thank you, Brent. And Joe, before we get to our next question, anything to add to what Brent just brought out?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. Standards, knowing boundaries, knowing what you can and can't do, knowing what crosses into unlicensed territory is also a really important thing. Don't be an accidental adjuster. I think there's an article from RA about that, right? And so how do we protect ourselves as contractors? I think a lot of the gray areas come down to discipline and behavior. And where contractors are most tempted to enter into the gray area is when discipline breaks down or process breaks down, and there's not clean behaviors on what good looks like. I think there's things that RA can do to support this in standardizing communication practices, standardizing best practices for insurance interaction, but also best practices for documentation and what needs to be presented. But just think of some examples. When the system erodes, it creates those temptations because you're dealing with these new pressures. And so on the one hand, you could think I'm not committing fraud by adjusting the scope to come to an agreement, and maybe even by giving in early just to increase cash flow on the project. You may accept something that isn't accurate just to speed up the cash flow process. While that may not be explicitly fraud, you're eroding confidence in the system. You're eroding confidence that the standards matter and that they have value and that we should follow them. And on the flip side, there may be pressures to misapply the standards that are used on a regular basis. And I know intent, may not always be wrong, but it certainly feels like it when it happens on a repetitive basis. And so misrepresenting standards to try to convince an unaware contractor or maybe an unskilled contractor to give in early or accept a different outcome, that's also a practice. And these all happen through these gray areas of these pressures of margin pressure, cost pressure, skill gaps. All these things create these new pressures. And you see more temptation to enter into the gray area. And the more time you spend in the gray area, the more accidental crossing of the line a good person might make. And that kind of misrepresentation that happens, it hurts the company. It hurts the process. It hurts the industry because you appear like a bad actor, but most importantly to me, it hurts the customer, the people that were there to support in their greatest time of need. And every time that works and we give in early or we misrepresent the facts, it just keeps reinforcing that pressure works. And this pressure is then utilized as a negotiation tool, and the lines get crossed, and then decisions are made based on outcomes instead of actually reflecting the true merits of the job. And so I think it's where we can do a better job as an industry is setting standards around what should you do, what should you not do, uh, what is good documentation. But I think we could also do a better job of defining how to tell our story of what we did, not just what, but why, when, and through the process, tell just a better picture that provides accurate information that shows that we're good actors and stop sorting ourselves into these camps of good people and bad people.
Thank you, Joe. Let's stick with you on this and get your thoughts first, and then Brenna, if you have follow up. And we've talked about this a bit, but from your perspective, how does fraud on one side of the industry, whether it's contractors, adjusters, or others, impact others in the process? And I'm thinking you might have a company that's very ethical and they're like, we don't do any of this, but it must impact
Right.
them too. Talk about that.
Right. Yeah, I'm gonna go internal first and look at restoration contractors. This is my space, right? And before we look external and blame others, we really have to make sure our own house is in order. When contractors cut corners, whether that's intentional or maybe even accidental, uh, maybe they cut corners to move faster, maybe they cut corners to expand margin. It erodes the confidence in the standards and best practices that are set forth, whether that's IICRC guidelines, whether that is ethical practices within the RIA, whether that is acting in bad faith as a public adjuster, which is outside of your boundaries. And when that happens, it creates this overreaction and overreach on the other end because maybe you appear like you're a bad actor, and it just overall erodes confidence in the restoration space, and that begins to create additional pressures from the other end that appear like overreach. And as you start seeing that overreach, it pushes contractors into a defensive position, and the cycle just keeps it's a cycle to the bottom. I think on the other end, though, where it hurts the carrier is the level of friction that can occur in the industry when we pit ourselves against each other. It's hurting the customer. It's hurting timeliness of payouts. It's hurting the customer to get back into their own home, but it's also hurting the carrier because that process slows down and becomes an administrative burden on the entire industry. So I don't think it's about calling out one side or the other. It's about recognizing that the breakdowns anywhere in the process raise the costs. It reduces confidence in the professionalism of me as a contractor and the industry as a whole. And it creates this kind of cycle, constant cycle of constant friction. And it's a rinse, wash, and repeat process that in the end, the customer loses every single time.
Yep, that's where it filters down to, it seems, for sure. And Brent, before we go to our next question, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I will attempt, but Joe did it, framed it very nicely. If you think about it from like a flat line, the further apart the two sides are, the worse it is for the customer, right? It's not always easy to meet in the middle. I get that. But as Joe said so well, it just erodes trust. It adds administrative burden and delays to the entire process. And not to mention, when fraud creeps into the system, it increases the cost of doing business for everyone. Good businesses are having a hard time competing with the fraudsters. Premiums are raised for the consumers. And so you have this frustration added to that formula. And it really just drags the entire process down. And as Joe said, the ultimate loser is the customer. You asked about both sides. I do want to point out, because Joe said something else earlier. He said, who controls the scope controls the money. But I would say in the context of fraud, who creates the scope or the estimate also increasingly with state statutes is going to be viewed as the fraudster. We have state legislation now that says just that. Insurance fraud can be defined as, in property and casualty property claims, the person who intentionally created a false scope of repair or estimate. And that's now become a national model, and more states will come online with that. So just consider that too. It is trying to find out who is responsible for that intentional misrepresentation. And it has to be intentional. And we have to prove that on the other side. But it is the person who writes the scope, the estimate. In some states, and again, increasingly, states are taking notice of that will be considered to have been committed to fraud. On the other side, lawmakers are also creating more insurer accountability, especially around the changing of estimates, adjuster estimates. And so more states are coming online with laws that say if an insurer is going to change an estimate, they have to be transparent and explain that change. And so we again are trying to find this balance between, I hate to say both sides, but we're trying to find this balance between both sides so that we both can serve the customer.
Joe, let's move into proven solutions and tools available for the industry. For those watching this today, there's help. Many restorers aren't familiar with RA's position statements or how to use them. How can they help professionals operate more ethically and protect themselves?
Yeah, this is a great topic and one I'm very passionate about. RIA position papers have existed for a number of years. Some of them have been downloaded one time, some 100 times, some a few hundred times. And in and of themselves, the position papers are really just words on a piece of paper that provide guidance and something people can read, and maybe they agree with them, maybe they don't, and then they move on. But when you take them as a collective whole and you start using them as an operating system, they become a really powerful tool. They define what the standard actually looks like, and not so much like good restoration work, but the standard of communication, the standard of best practices. What does it look like? What are the fair practices should be across the entire industry? And they give the contractor something that's been missing for a long time: common language. So instead of arguing on your own opinion that I believe I'm owed this, you can argue I am owed this, and here's the reasons why. A few examples of the RA position papers are pricing deviation. When can and should you deviate from standard pricing? And what are the boundaries for that contractually based on the user agreement you signed up with that particular software? Other practices: what can a TPA do? What can a TPA not do? It's some legal protection. It's some guidance, best practice guidance. That in and of itself, it's not just a document to download, read, and say, great, that's cool, and maybe send it off to an adjuster and say, here you go, read this thing and go ahead and agree with me. But when you combine it as a collective unit, it creates confidence. That it's not just you. You're no longer standing on your own as an independent contractor in your own opinion of the way things should be, but you're standing with the backing of the entire industry. Not just papers that the RIA has produced, but a lot of these papers have been reviewed and endorsed by whether it's carriers, Xactimate themselves, or other providers, and they're source documents, and they reference the key sections that you should reference as a contractor. We're really focused on this in education committee right now, not just what the papers say, but how do you use them? And how do you infuse them down into your business? We're working on a beta program to train individual specific roles within your company: technicians, project managers, administrative staff, collectors, estimators, general managers. What are the papers? How do you use them? And what are the consistent common language you can use within your business to stand behind your work and to create consistency across the entire network of businesses? And I think to Brent's point, this helps protect you from overstepping and maybe accidentally moving too far in a gray area. It also gives you confidence that you can protect margin without using, kind of manipulation of scope to expand your margin, right? And so you allow the merits of the project to stand on its own. And back to that point of if we have to manipulate scope to achieve margin, there's a pricing problem. These position papers help you understand what are the tools that you're using and how can you help solve that within your own specific instance to really analyze your own internal business and understand how you should accurately reflect your cost structure as you go to invoice with an insurance carrier. And what are your rights to do and not to do as part of that process?
Thank you, Joe. I liked your comment about having that backing, that support is so important. Operating on a private island is just not a good spot to be in.
Yeah.
You're going to lose that battle. So, Brent, any follow up to that before we get to our last question?
No, I agree with what Joe said. That good faith effort to rely upon an industry standard, and I won't get into the content of those position papers, but having an industry standard does help you defend or reduce your exposure to an allegation of fraud. The intent or the good faith is that you're following these industry standards, versus, as you said, being on the island and perhaps crossing the line and getting into not the gray area now, but the area where you have a suspicion of fraud. And I want to applaud RIA in being collaborative with the insurance industry, and that's evident by the Carrier Representative Task Force. And so, Joe, you mentioned, sharing these position statements with the insurers and adjusters. And so I do think there is a good faith effort by associations like RIA to meet in the middle so that we can all take care of the customer. So thank you.
Thank you, Brent. All right, one final question. Brent, we'll start with you, and then Joe, you're getting the final word, so get ready for that. For someone listening who wants to do the right thing, but also stay competitive because they have to, what are a few practical steps they can take right now to reduce risk and help push the industry in a better direction? Brent?
Yeah, I'm going to repeat a lot of what I've already said, but it's sort of simple. Just do the right thing. And I know that there's some complexity in that, but we're speaking of RIA's resources. The Code of Ethics are amazing. So the RIA Code of Ethics almost have a roadmap of how to do the right thing. Approach each project objectively. Again, be honest, fair, act in good faith, focus less on maximizing profits only for profit's sake. Write the estimate so that you can serve the customer. Referral relationships, revenue sharing agreements, not always bad, but again, we're talking about gray areas and crossing the line. Focus more on the customer, and I think things will work out. Try to avoid conflicts of interest when possible. Simple stuff. Be accurate, be transparent. And if it feels like you're cutting a corner, it's probably the wrong thing to do. And I think your industry standards and a lot of what Joe said makes a lot of sense there. And then finally, you never want to disparage a competitor, but if you do suspect anyone in the process is committing fraud, I do think everyone has a responsibility to report it. And there are mechanisms to report insurance fraud fairly. I do think you need to be acting in good faith. So you have to have some objective proof of facts or belief that you suspect fraud. But many state departments of insurance have an online portal where anyone can do that. I know the National Association of Insurance Commissioners has an online portal, and the National Insurance Crime Bureau, NICB, they also have an online fraud portal. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention May 18th through the 22nd, the NICB, the National Insurance Crime Bureau, is hosting the Contractor Fraud Awareness Week. So this is great timing, Jeff, on this conversation. And it's just, again, it's an event that will raise awareness by both consumers and good, honest businesses to say we won't tolerate this in our industry. And so going back to the original question, use your good reputation, use your ethical behavior as a competitive advantage. Don't be tempted to cross the line. I know it's tough, but stay true and use your good reputation and your ethical practices as your competitive advantage and take care of the customer.
Thank you, Brent. Before we move to Joe, Brent, you mentioned an event coming up. Now, people may watch this episode later, maybe months later. Is there something they can go back to benefit from that, even if not in attendance?
Absolutely. There's toolkits available online, and I'll share that with you, Jeff.
Okay, and we'll put that in the episode notes below so everyone can access those. Good ad. Thank you, Brent. All right,
Great.
Joe, tell us what you think. Practical thing.
Practical things. I'm going to speak very directly to contractors on this. I think there's some really simple things contractors can do. First is document the story, not just the result. We've focused too much on after the fact documentation. But you need to be able to explain what you did, when you did it, and why you did it, and make the story easy and clear to follow. And if you start there, then it begins to ease the process of being paid. And once you ease the process of being paid, you're less tempted to push the boundaries, plus you create more confidence in the process. Second, I'd recommend separating scope from pricing. Agree to scope first. Agree to what is right by the merits of the job. What do the guidelines say are the best thing to do? Too often we intertwine those together. And that's when, again, you become tempted to scope to a perceived outcome. If you tie your documentation practices to telling that story, you don't have to then use the scope to give you your perceived outcome, and that temptation is reduced. Third, know what's required versus recommended in the standards. This is where a lot of businesses break down of not truly understanding those kind of keywords within the standards, and then training our team to not just know the difference, but to be able to make good judgment calls in the field and have good processes and standards within your business on how to communicate why you're making that judgment call. We skip why too often in our documentation and communication. We just go to what we did. Fourth, use standard language. This is what our RIA papers can support in consistent language. Don't argue on your opinion. Don't rely on, I know what's best because I've been doing this for 16 years, but reference industry standards in those communications. And that goes beyond just IICRC. It goes into pricing guidelines. It goes into Xactimate licenses. It goes into ethical standards as well. And this is where the RIA can support you in there. And last, I would just recommend stay in the middle. Don't fight. You don't fight by fighting the system. We're one entire ecosystem together. Contractors win together as a whole, and we do interact with carriers on a regular basis. So you don't fight. You don't win by fighting the system entirely, but you also don't win by giving in to it. That becomes a race to the bottom. You win by doing quality work, backing it with standards and following standards and holding ourselves accountable to standards. And it allows for us to be confident in the file and what we did as a contractor. We did it the right way. Look, even when we do it right, there's going to be fights. There's going to be arguments. It's not always going to be smooth. And when you look into micro, that absolutely happens. You could do something right, and a carrier may come back and cut your invoice by $10,000. That still happens. It's part of the reality. But it's a different fight if you follow these steps, because it's not just your opinion. It's not just what you think is right. It's arguing on standards, documentation standards, and actual merits of the job, and having the restoration industry behind you and having IICRC behind you. And over time, it changes the outcomes. It starts building more consistency. It builds more credibility in you as a contractor, but as an industry, and then it makes the conversations shorter and more productive instead of head-to-head attacking each other. And when we continue to fight, that's when the temptation comes in for those gray areas to be exploited, and that just erodes confidence in the standards. If I were to make a single closing statement, it's really this: the future of the industry isn't really about picking sides, in my opinion. It's about raising the standards so good contractors can operate more confidently. We can get paid fairly and deliver for the customer what they deserve and what the system should be designed to provide to them, which is restoring homes and businesses, but more importantly, lives, to a life that they had before they suffered these catastrophic losses.
Great closing words, Joe. Joe and Brent, thank you both for your time today. It's been a pleasure.